Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business this afternoon is a members' business debate on motion number 8845 in the name of Patricia Ferguson on support for Syrian refugees. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And now call on Patricia Ferguson to open the debate. 7 minutes, please, today.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking all those colleagues from across the Parliament who signed my motion, making it possible for this debate to take place. Before speaking about the plight of the refugees in the Syrian conflict, I think it's worth reflecting on the situation in Syria that has led to so many of its citizens becoming displaced and forced to seek refuge where it can be found. In 2011, when a number of countries in the Middle East rose up against governments they regarded as dictatorial or unrepresentative, Syria was amongst their number. I expect that as we witnessed the beginning of the conflict there, we would have been surprised if someone had predicted that the Assad regime would still be defiantly in place in 2014. And the situation in Syria is undoubtedly complex. But to describe it, as the Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott did, as baddies versus baddies, entirely misses the point and glosses over the millions of innocent people caught up in this tragic conflict. We can only deplore a situation which has led to 100,000 people being killed, the sickening but credible reports of the systematic use of torture and starvation as weapons of war, and of course the outrageous use of chemical weapons. Now, during this civil war, atrocities have been committed by both sides. However, I think it's fair to say that one side regards what we call atrocities as merely a strategy in that conflict. Millions have fled their homes, with 6.5 million people displaced within Syria and 2.3 million fleeing to neighbouring countries. Of that 2.3 million, it is estimated that more than half are children. Within Syria, aid agencies and NGOs have struggled to reach those who need help. This is in spite of valiant efforts to do so. It is right that we acknowledge the bravery of those who do this extremely dangerous work. Working in areas of conflict is always a very risky business, and in this conflict alone, 34 volunteers of the Syrian Red Crescent have been killed while performing humanitarian duties. And just last week, vehicles clearly displaying the emblems of the Red Cross and Red Crescent came under fire as they tried to enter the city of Homs. The best possible outcome would, of course, be a negotiated end to the conflict and a peaceful political transition, but unfortunately that seems a long way off. So meanwhile, without giving up on the diplomatic efforts, the outside world must turn its attention to the additional help it can provide. The countries which share a border with Syria are now inundated with refugees, with the population of Lebanon, for example, estimated to have risen by a staggering 25% as a result. Clearly, these countries cannot be expected to bear the burden alone. That's why my colleagues at Westminster were so firm in their resolve in arguing that the UK should play its part. Now, let me put on record now my sincere praise for the UK Government, which pledged £600 million for relief, the second highest contribution after the USA. And the Scottish Government also deserves real credit for its contribution of £200,000. However, I am disappointed that it took 6 months of campaigning by the Labour Party, with the help of other opposition parties at Westminster, some backbench members of the coalition, refugee councils across the country, many of the aid organisations and some national newspapers to persuade the coalition government that it must accept refugees. And let's remember that only a week before Theresa May's announcement, Minister Mark Harper described any UK government resettlement of refugees as being tokenistic. But of course, the UK government's proposal, while welcome, is to accept the most vulnerable refugees in numbers likely to be in the hundreds from a conflict likely to result in 4.1 million refugees. A country which played such a vital role in assisting Kosovan refugees and people escaping other conflicts over the years can surely do better. The Scottish Government was quick to react and to say that it would play its part in the resettlement of Syrians. And if the Minister is able to provide any insight into how those negotiations might play out, that would be very helpful. However, I would hope that the Scottish Government might push the UK Government to do more by demonstrating that Scotland stands ready to assist. The Syrian refugees I have met, who are involved in the excellent Maryhill Integration Network, are absolutely clear that they don't want to be refugees, that they want to be at home. But while they're here, they will play their part in the lives of our communities. Now, finally, Presiding Officer, because I know other members want to speak, I think we have to mention the role that Gordon Brown MP is playing in drawing attention to the very real prospect that an entire generation of young Syrians may be deprived of an education. And I think that view should be supported. And given Scotland's proud record in education over the centuries, perhaps this is an area where we could provide particular help and expertise. And I'll end with a quote from Gordon Brown, which to me encapsulates the issue. Young people need more than food, a home and vaccinations. They need hope, which is what education offers. Allowing children to plan for the future and preventing young people already scarred from war from becoming a lost generation. If, through the creation of the Red Cross and later Médecins Sans Frontières, the right to health care, even in conflict, has become the norm for more than a century, then we can achieve the same for education in 2014 and prise open a window of hope amidst the increasing despair. Thank you.
Thank you for your brevity. We are tight for time today, so can I now call Jim Eadie to be followed by Claudia Beamish, 4 minutes and no more, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Patricia Ferguson deserves huge credit for bringing this important debate on the condition of Syria's refugees before the Chamber this afternoon, what has become, for many in this country, a forgotten issue. But Patricia has not forgotten this issue, and I'm glad that we in this Parliament are giving it the attention that it deserves. As the United Nations Security Council considers a draft resolution aimed at increasing access to humanitarian aid in Syria, this debate is particularly timely. Although a positive result from this latest round of peace talks is uncertain, if not unlikely, I know that members across the Chamber will share a deep desire to see these talks succeed and for there to be a diplomatic breakthrough that the people of Syria so desperately need and deserve. In March 2012, I led a members' debate to highlight the terrible atrocities and devastating violence taking place in Syria at that time. At the time of the debate, the civil war had claimed the lives of over 8,000 people and displaced around 200,000 people. 2 years on, the situation in Syria has deteriorated immeasurably into a crisis that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has described as, and I quote, the greatest tragedy of this century, a disgraceful humanitarian calamity with suffering and displacement unparalleled in recent history. Now in its third year, Syria's civil war has displaced over 4 million people internally and forced more than 2 million people to flee their country for the relative safety of neighbouring countries. And according to figures released by the UN at the end of last year, over 2 million refugees from Syria had been registered in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. The flow of people and families across Syria's border continues to swell far beyond initial expectations, and this is putting considerable strain on the region's already limited resources. Communities in neighbouring countries have been extraordinarily generous in hosting vulnerable Syrian refugees, and the international community owes a huge debt of gratitude to these countries for keeping their borders open and continuing to offer safety and sanctuary to those people forced to leave their homes. Given the scale of the humanitarian crisis, the challenge for the international community and aid agencies must be to support and assist these countries and to share the burden wherever possible. And it would be churlish not to pay tribute to the UK Government for its significant investment in that endeavour, with the commitment of over £500 million to support inside Syria and for support to the region. Patricia Ferguson's motion recognises the need for Scotland to play its part as a good global citizen in supporting the international effort to provide humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees. And I'm pleased the Scottish Government has provided more than £200,000 to the Disasters Emergency Committee's Syria Crisis Appeal, and that according to the Scottish Refugee Council, at least £1 million of the £23 million donated has come from people in Scotland. This, of course, demonstrates the tremendous generosity of people from all over the country who understandably want to do all that they can to help those most in need. And as the conflict continues and the numbers of displaced people and refugees rise, it is essential that humanitarian agencies and organisations continue to respond quickly and effectively and at a meaningful scale. Aid agencies continue to play a pivotal role, and I'm proud to have the European headquarters of Mercy Corps based within my own constituency. Mercy Corps is succeeding in delivering assistance on the largest possible scale, reaching more than 2 million people both inside and outside Syria. While much of their efforts are focused on meeting the most urgent and immediate humanitarian needs, Mercy Corps is constantly seeking opportunities to work alongside populations affected by the conflict in Syria to build long-term resilience to recurring shocks and stresses related to exposure to conflict and displacement. The sad truth is that the global community is disunited as to how to bring an end to the conflict in Syria. However, there can be no disagreement over the need to alleviate human suffering and of the world's responsibility to do more. Is it not time for the UK and Scotland to meet our international obligations to accept more refugees and to do more to help the men, women and children in Syria?
Thank you. Now call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin by also thanking my colleague Patricia Ferguson for securing this debate today. I'm sure all members will agree that the ongoing political and humanitarian crisis in Syria is extremely troubling and that more must be done to end the plight of the Syrian people. Though we hear much in the news about the conflict between the Assad-led regime and the disparate branches of the opposition, it is sometimes forgotten that many ordinary Syrians just want to be able to get on with their lives without fear of violence on both sides. It is a sad fact of war that it is difficult to be clear about who is fighting for the freedom of the Syrian people and who is using the conflict to further their own ends. Recent reports from Human Rights Watch and others suggest that both sides have perpetrated war crimes, though it appears that the regime forces have been most guilty in this regard. And as a co-convener of the Cross-Party Group for Palestine, I do take a particular interest in the Middle East, though I'm absolutely in no way an expert. As Patricia Ferguson highlighted, members will remember the beginnings of the Syrian conflict in 2011 and the Arab Spring. I'm not sure any of us thought that the Assad regime would last this long, and indeed, if recent events are anything to go by, it may still continue for some time. While measures have been taken to ensure the removal of chemical and biological weapons from Syria, I am, of course, supportive of these measures, but there is still far more violence being carried out with conventional weapons, which must be addressed with through the international community. We were all, of course, hopeful that Mr. Brahimi's mediation efforts in the Geneva II negotiations would be successful, but it appears that very little has been achieved, at least publicly. The recent situation in Homs demonstrates the difficulties in bringing about even the most basic humanitarian measures, and the Red Cross and the Red Crescent have called for unimpeded access to besieged areas, and the UN-backed humanitarian pause was certainly a step forward, allowing civilians to be evacuated. However, the International Committee of the Red Cross still have grave concerns about, and I quote, a commitment from all sides to respect the basic principles of international humanitarian law. The likelihood of a continued political stalemate makes the need to help Syrian refugees all the more important. As former Foreign Secretary David Miliband has said, if peace cannot be bought, how can humanity be brought to the conduct of war? The humanitarian crisis is indeed extreme, as Patricia Ferguson said in her motion, and Jim Eadie highlighted as well. Neighbouring countries feel the strain of the massive influx of refugees. I believe the number of refugees in Lebanon alone has now surpassed 1 million people. In a country of less than 5 million, this is an astounding statistic, and I'm sure members will join with me in commending the valuable help provided by Oxfam and others who have been ensuring vulnerable people in Lebanon from Syria have safe housing and their basic needs are addressed. Under the UN High Commissioner for the refugee scheme, other European countries have committed to admitting significant numbers of refugees, 11,000 in Germany, I believe. I'm sure this chamber would agree that Scotland would be more than willing to play its part should this scheme be adopted by the UK. According to the Home Secretary, 3,500 Syrian asylum seekers have been admitted to the UK by way of UK borders, but rather than the government actively bringing people here. I recognise the British government has done something to provide aid to those still trapped in Syria, and I welcome the commitment to work towards a political settlement. I also echo the words of John Wilkes of the Scottish Refugee Council, who says the most needy people needing a home, we must offer that in our country. But I feel that the UK could do more to take part in the UN scheme, and the Scottish Government is certainly playing its part in this, and I encourage them to do all they can with our support across this chamber.
Many thanks. Now, Colin Bob Doris, to be followed by Alex Johnson. Up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I pay tribute to Patricia Ferguson for bringing this motion, this debate to Parliament this afternoon. I don't really have any prepared script. I wanted to tell you my experience at a refugee camp in the Kurdish region, northern Iraq, during the summer. I had been at Halabja, and on the way back I found out that Kurdistan had opened their borders for refugees from Syria, and their primary schools, which were on holiday at the time, became the first point of contact for the refugees to get some food, get some water, get some basic bedding before they went on to more stable accommodation in larger refugee camps. I want to tell you a specific story of a family that I met through friends who were translating. I asked them about the fighting, and I asked why they left, and they didn't want this thing I should say to people who sometimes take a very different view of immigration and asylum. These people did not want to leave Syria. Well, they believe they were in Kurdistan, I have to point out, but they did not want to leave their home. They left because they weren't safe. I asked who they weren't safe from, and they said it didn't matter which side in the conflict were there, they were being persecuted. And it is simplistic to say it's baddies versus baddies. So the Australian Prime Minister was wrong. And Assad is institutionalised atrocities that are going on. And yes, others may be committing atrocities, but what that government are doing is institutionalised attacks on human rights. But for that family I spoke to, kind of who wins that conflict doesn't seem to matter to them. What matters to them is to be safe with their families. But when the conflict does finish, whoever's in charge, they just want to be safe. They see themselves vulnerable because of a wider geopolitical situation, which they don't care about. They just want their families to be safe. I can tell you another couple of things about my experience there, about the families I met. They don't like Scottish Parliament tablet or fudge. I gave it to them. It was too sweet for them. I know that. But whilst I was there, also a child was having breathing difficulties, and we mentioned to the people organising the aid there, and within 5 minutes an ambulance arrived to take them away to hospital. I have to say that probably was just because there was a member of the Scottish Parliament in that particular refugee camp, not because they didn't care about that child and that family, but because they're so overwhelmed by what they actually have to do, and they have to prioritise the most serious cases. And I have to say, believe it or not, that child with breathing difficulties may not have been the most serious case they had to deal with. So I would just say, yes, it's right that the UK takes, I was going to say fair share of refugees. We should just take as many as we are able to take in an organised fashion from these people who are under attack sometimes from all sides, who just want to be safe. And I do hope, as refugees come from the Syrian conflict to the UK, to Scotland, that they don't have to go through any kind of complicated asylum process. I hope that before they arrive, and I'm sure Patricia Ferguson will agree with this, we've identified their accommodation, we've identified their children's primary schools, we've identified the wraparound care they need to get on with their lives, because other members have talked about the huge numbers of people involved, but actually forget about the huge numbers just a little bit, because each individual and each family have a value and existence and a human worth in their own right. So when we take these vulnerable people to Scotland, let's make sure we don't just make them safe, but we give them the best possible time of their life to go forward from what has been a horrific experience for them. And I hope that one day those people won't have to flee from their part of Kurdistan like they've had to do, irrespective of who's in charge.
Many thanks. Now, Colin Alex Johnson, to be followed by Sandra White. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by expressing my thanks to Patricia Ferguson for bringing this matter before the Parliament for debate, and also expressing my apologies for not actually having signed the motion. I hope she will take my sincere support for the motion now in substitute for that failure, because I do support this motion that she's brought forward, and there are some key issues which we need to discuss. However, I thought I would take a slightly different view and set a question in the minds of everyone who participates in this debate. The involvement of this country in conflicts in the Middle East is something that we have a record of, and it's not always a good one. We started many years ago when we first intervened in the Balkans and saw that as a positive use of UK military force, along with our allies. And we held that up as an example of what can be achieved when we do the right thing in a timely fashion. Subsequent experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have significantly changed public opinion. And when there was a call for us to intervene in Libya, I think we reached a significant point in our consideration as to what we can do and what we should do in a country like this to intervene. The decision that took place in the House of Commons in relation to Syria was genuinely a watershed. It was a moment when people took a different view for the first time, decided that intervention was not appropriate and that a different course of action should be the one that we pursue. In fact, that decision that was taken in the House of Commons then led on to similar and parallel decisions in a number of other parliaments around the world. So the situation we find ourselves in is one in which we are for the first time trying to deal with this largely through a diplomatic route and solution rather than a military one. And whatever your view, it is something that is worth pursuing and worth making successful. In fact, the experiment that happened within this over the biological weapons issue is one which demonstrated that it can work effectively when we all work together with a common interest. However, dealing with the refugee problem is something which many of the forces at work here have simply failed to address adequately. If we could get the same level of support for the refugee issue as we did for the biological weapons issue, then I think progress could be made much quicker. The truth is that there is a roadblock within the United Nations and a significant difficulty in finding a solution which will work quickly. We are now in a position where not only refugees are spilling out into other countries neighbouring Syria, but there is some danger or some prospect that the conflict itself could begin to spill out. For that reason, we need to redouble our efforts, and everything that is listed in this motion, I believe, is vital to success on behalf of the refugees themselves. But the solution in Syria is the only thing that will ever deliver the opportunity for the Syrian refugees to return to their home and live in their homeland in peace. That aspiration is one which I cannot steer us towards at this moment. So for that reason, I think it's essential that we all are prepared to work together, to do what we can for the refugees and to continue the diplomatic effort. Because the one difficulty we have with the diplomatic solution is, like all diplomacy, it takes time. And the refugees of Syria are running out of time.
Many thanks. I call on Sandra White to be followed by Sarah Boyer.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank Patricia Ferguson for securing this debate and thank the many charities and people, both local and national, who have donated not only monies but their services to help, as the motion states, the estimated 6.5 million who have displaced and the 2.4 million who have sought refugee status in neighbouring countries. Presiding Officer, I visited Syria a couple of years ago, and along with one of my colleagues, Polly McNeill, who will be known to yourselves, and others, we met President Assad. Very courteous, we met President Assad. We were given free rein to go throughout Syria, to speak to groups, to visit people in their homes, to visit refugee camps. I found the warmth of the people there fantastic, and I thought the country was an absolutely beautiful country. Very saddened that it's came to this, and had spoke to my friends in the refugee community that Patricia mentioned, Mary Hill Network, and others who live both in Syria, Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East. What's happened here? What has happened? Coming from a country which, as I said, is beautiful, speaking to people, being given dinner, being given overnight stays, and all of a sudden these people are subject to the refugees, they're killed in their thousands, and what can we do about it? As I said, I really do thank the charities who put forward their services, and we of course have to commit to that aid. But I think we also have to look at the international situation, and I know that Alec Johnson touched on that particular point. Yes, I mean, aid is vital. There's one place that I visited in Syria, along with others, which was actually a Yarmouk refugee camp, which was set up in 1948 after the Israeli war in 1948, and around about 150,000 Palestinians live alongside Syrians in that area. Now, the Palestinians in that refugee camp had full access to employment, education and social services, unlike other countries in the Middle East. Now, the people in that camp, both Palestinian and Syrians, are absolutely starving to death. And if anyone had to see anything, the video which was on YouTube, they will see pictures of young children that we don't want to see, going back to many, many years. And that's the situation in these refugee camps in Syria at the moment. Patricia Ferguson mentioned Lebanon hosting the largest number of Syrian refugees, over 1 million. I think Claudia Beamish also mentioned this. As I said previously, having visited both these countries, having visited other countries in the Middle East, it deeply saddens me to see the fact that these countries have come to this. And whilst, as I said, we do need to make sure there's aid, we do need to look at the international community and get them round the table. We've seen many things happen in the Middle East. Alec Johnson mentioned about intervention, which illegal wars in Iraq and other interventions which we should never have been involved in. And I do agree it's a diplomatic solution that is needed here. But whilst we leave the Middle East in this particular situation, not just the Palestinians but others, this will continue to go on, and I'll still have troubled thoughts. My friends in Syria, Lebanon and Palestine will still have troubled thoughts. When is this going to end? And I really would appeal to the ministers, and I hope the minister can speak to their counterparts in Westminster and do something to actually let the world see we cannot afford this beautiful part of the world, this region in the Middle East, to go down this road. Intervention is needed, but it needs to be diplomatic intervention. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Thank
you, Ms White. Thank you very much. Now call on Sarah Boyack, after which move the closing speech to the Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to thank Patricia Ferguson for securing us this debate today. But I also do want to thank Oxfam, the Red Cross and the Scottish Refugee Council for their briefings and for all the work that they and other charities are doing in what is an incredibly difficult situation, as all colleagues have discussed. And it's not possible to look at this situation without a sense of despair. It's actually difficult to comprehend that a third of all Syrians have been displaced within Syria, 6.5 million people, and that 2.5 million have left Syria. And it's just impossible to just kind of imagine the stress and strain that's putting on people, with millions of people living on camps and makeshift settlements and borders. And life in those camps is just impossible for us to imagine. And I think there's a particular issue that I think Patricia Ferguson highlighted very well about the impact on children. It's a general impact on anyone who's been a refugee, but the lives that children are currently living and the level of disruption to their lives, and the fact that this conflict has gone on for over 3 years now, should force us to think about what more we can do. And I think Patricia's point about thinking about how the world and how Scotland in particular could add to that agenda, I think is something we should all agree to work together on. And I'm not asking for a response today, but I hope that ministers will take that point away and think about it. If you think about the tremendous impact we've had in Malawi with focused actions from people in communities in Scotland, whether it's educationalists or people in the health service, I think there's something we could do to work with charities in Scotland and our own civic communities to think about practical things we can do, because the situation is desperate, as everyone else has said. We had the most recent attempts at peace talks failing last month, but that was also the month when the UNHCR stopped updating the death toll. The death toll rests over 100,000. But the UNHCR have decided that they are simply not able to verify deaths since July of last year. Now, that is just a horrendous situation. So we know that the official death toll will not reflect reality. So it's a difficult situation for the people living in Syria and on the borders and in exile, but it's also an incredibly difficult situation for those charities working in the region. And the scale of conflict and the fact that charities are not even being recognised at the moment, I think is something that should concern us all. So we need to thank those aid workers who are putting their lives on the line on a daily basis. I would agree with others as well in the Chamber about welcoming the huge generosity that's come from people across Scotland. And I think there are some fantastic lessons we can learn from that. I know in my own area, the Pakistan Society did work with Aid for All, a central Scotland-based charity. And their report and their work was incredibly moving. And a reality check, they were talking about providing dentistry. Now, people are going to be refugees for so long that actually the health of your teeth is going to be a really important issue, because once you've lost your teeth, you don't get them back. And I think it was that human side of the tragedy that actually brought it home to everybody in the hall that night. I also want to give our former colleague Pauline McNeill a name check. She organised Salsa for Syria, a fundraiser on Sunday night, which I have to say Joanne Lamont and I attended. It was a great success, and we want to encourage people across the country to do whatever they can, whatever kind of community they're involved in, whatever works in terms of raising awareness and money for Syria. We should do it because people need our support, and we can act not just in the Chamber, but we can act to help mobilise our communities. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we do need to support calls for rapid and unimpeded access to aid agencies. They deserve nothing less. They're putting their lives on the line, and they're acting for the world community who are objecting to this horrendous situation where both sides will not agree peace. We need to support the people of Syria. We need to do everything we can, and to add our influence to support not just for a ceasefire, but for the UK to do its bit on helping to take our share of Syrian refugees. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I call on Minister Humza Yousaf to wind up the debate on behalf of the Government. Please, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me, from the offset, of course, thank Patricia Ferguson for bringing this motion to the Parliament, and for all those members who signed it. It's one of those debates we'd rather not be having, but it's important because of the circumstance that we have it. I thought some very all-impressive contributions throughout the Chamber, and I'll try to reflect on some of them as I move through my remarks. But I think I'll start with Bob Doris's contribution. I thought an incredibly powerful and moving account, but he said there quite rightly and quite poignantly that nobody chooses to be a refugee. It doesn't matter what country you're fleeing from, what conflict you're fleeing from, what the circumstances, nobody chooses to be a refugee. Some of the statistics are staggering that I heard across the Chamber and that I've seen in various briefings from Scottish Refugee Council, UNHCR, the Red Cross and others. Half the Scottish population, almost 45% of the Scottish population, in exodus as refugees outside of the country, more than the Scottish population, more than the entire country internally displaced. And some of the figures, the numbers become mind-boggling. I wouldn't say they don't matter. Of course, statistics matter, but almost you can't comprehend the numbers. I struggle to comprehend them. But although there is despair, and Sarah Boyack had mentioned some of that, I think we shouldn't despair, because we can't allow ourselves to go into a cycle of hopelessness, because not for our own sakes, but for the sakes of those Syrian refugees who are in camps in many countries neighbouring the country. I, of course, unequivocally, as we all do, condemn the violence. It doesn't matter who's perpetrating it and who's perpetrating that atrocity or human rights atrocity. We condemn it unequivocally. A particular reference, of course, to chemical weapons. We are seeing in emerging conflicts, particularly in that region, the use of chemical weapons. And we are right, and the UK government is right to be strong in their condemnation of that particular element of the conflict. Practically, what can we do? Reference has been made, of course, to the Scottish Government's contribution to the Disasters Emergency Committee Syria appeal. Scots have been incredibly generous, raising thus far £1.5 million. Applaud the leadership shown by the UK Government in terms of what they've contributed towards Syria. £600 million shows a real commitment to taking leadership in that conflict. And the many Scottish charities that have been mentioned. Jim Eadie mentioned Mercy Corps, who I've had the pleasure of working with since becoming a minister. and know much of their work. Syria for All, a new established charity, Sarah Boyack, she mentions, I also have had conversations with. But the many churches and faith groups and others, community grassroots organisations who can't bear to see what they're viewing on the television without inherently wanting to help and do something and just doing their part. I applaud every single one of them. And Sarah Boyack's very important point about aid workers putting their lives at risk. We saw just last week Red Cross workers, Red Crescent workers in their ambulance being shot at Homs. And there they were, just delivering to the poorest and the most needy, not giving a care for their own lives. Actually, when they got shot at, they said, we'll come back in an hour. They'll come back in an hour. I mean, an unbelievable humanitarian spirit, which I think deserves to be applauded. Jim Eadie made a good point that the Arab Spring is happening and we should not forget it, so it's important to have this debate, and I'll reflect on that as well. I thought one of the themes that was mentioned particularly well by Sarah Boyack and also Patricia Ferguson was this idea about what contribution can Scotland make specifically and what positive contribution can we make. And Sarah Boyack touched on the Malawi relationship, which I think is a good parallel in that respect. And I think Scotland can make a good contribution where we have expertise, and education was mentioned by Patricia Ferguson, and I'm more than happy to explore the idea in terms of education. I know some of the good work Gordon Brown has done in education in the Punjab. When I met with Governor Sawa of the Punjab, he was telling me about some of what Gordon Brown was doing there, and if there's something that we can do, of course I would be happy to speak to the Cabinet Secretary for Education to see what we can do on that front. If Patricia Ferguson has any ideas, as I say, look at them with an open mind. Scotland has had a history of welcoming refugees. Outside of this chamber, we have an exhibition by SCOGEC, the Scottish Council for Jewish Communities, reminding us, of course, of Scotland's own contribution to taking Jewish refugees. Of course, we've taken refugees from, over the last 20 years, from Bosnia, from Kosovo, and from the DRC as well. I'm very proud that the First Minister was the first leader, certainly that we know of a government to write to the UK government to say that the UK government should be taking Syrian refugees, but also, quite rightly, that Scotland would be willing to play her part. Just on Patricia Ferguson's specific question, Theresa May has written to the First Minister to say that, after her announcement on the 29th of January, to say that they'll be looking to take Syrian refugees, and of course noting the First Minister's offer of Scotland playing her part as well. We've entered into discussions, as you'll imagine, at official level with the Home Office, but also including stakeholders like COSLA, Strategic Migration Partnership, and others as well. I promise to keep and endeavour to keep Patricia and the Chamber updated. When we have an update, she'll know that it will take time to rifle through many of the issues, but we will ensure that we do that. I started my remarks by talking about the importance not to lose hope and not to have too much despair, and I was reminded of throughout the contributions, because of the devastating nature of this conflict and the refugee crisis, I was reminded of that Robert Burns quote, which will be familiar to all of us, that man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn, in this case countless millions. But then I remembered, of course, another Burns quote, which will be familiar to all, of course, too, that man to man the world over shall brothers be for all that. And I think when it comes to our contribution to this conflict, how we can positively contribute, it should be via that spirit of, it doesn't matter where you're coming from or from what side of the conflict you support or who it is that bulldozed your home or for what reason you had to leave your country. Scotland is prepared to stand with you, to open our arms to you and to welcome you to Scotland and to make this as much a home as it possibly can be. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes the members' business debate on support for Syrian refugees. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate